Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker and today's video is a continuation of my NBA season preview series for the 2019-20 NBA season, and this one covers the Houston Rockets. The Rockets finished with a 53-29 record last year, which was a 12-win drop-off from the amazing season that they had the year before. And they only got to that win total because James Harden had an absolutely ridiculous season, specifically once Chris Paul went down with injuries throughout the year. But even with some struggles that they had during the year last year, because of Harden as well as their new addition Russell Westbrook and the system that Houston has implemented over the last couple of seasons, they still enter this year, despite the strength of the Western Conference, as one of the most dangerous teams in that side of the league, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and review their offseason, and of course we're going to start with Russell Westbrook. And once it became clear that the Rockets were interested in trading away Chris Paul, there were multiple trade targets that it seemed like they were going after, and once Paul George was traded away from Oklahoma City, it seemed relatively logical that Westbrook would end up in Houston. And initially, a lot of people had mixed opinions on this because Westbrook is obviously a great playmaker from a statistical standpoint, and in theory seems like he would fit really well in a Mike D'Antoni offense if he was the guy and the only guy kind of in the James Harden role creating for other players. But when you already have Harden there's some question marks in terms of how Westbrook and Harden are going to be able to play together at this stage of their career, specifically Westbrook's inability to shoot off the ball. And although I do think those are legitimate concerns, I also believe in this system and Mike D'Antoni's ability to sustain two high-level playmakers and ball handlers in this system. And I think it's going to be a really exciting thing to watch. I think Westbrook is going to have another incredible statistical season, and I really believe in this combination. And again, their ability to just stagger those minutes and have one of these guys on the floor at all times, because even with some of the struggles that Westbrook maybe had last year and throughout his career from a shooting efficiency standpoint, he is still a better player, and in my opinion, a much better player than Chris Paul at this stage of their careers. And I think he's going to be outstanding in his first year in Houston, even though, like I said, there's going to be some issues in terms of when him and Harden are on the floor together, who's going to get the ball, their inability to kind of play off the ball, and obviously Westbrook's inability to shoot. Those are going to be issues, but to have one of these guys on the floor for all 48 minutes of every single game is going to be such a huge deal for this team, and I think he's going to be really, really good, and I can't wait to see them play. Moving on now to some certainly less glamorous additions, and this one is Ben McLemore, who was brought in on a low salary deal, essentially just to see if he can be a floor spacer for this team. And we've seen the Rockets make these kinds of moves over the last couple of seasons, hoping that their system brings up the statistical contributions of some players that have kind of been thrown by the wayside by some other teams. McLemore certainly has talent as a shooter and occasional scorer. It just depends on how consistent he is and how many jump shots he's actually going to be able to knock down through the course of the game throughout the season, but it is at least a good idea to try him out and see if it'll work. Moving on now, in a similar kind of situation is Thabo Sefolosha, although obviously he is supposed to be a much better defender than McLemore this stage in his career, even though he is getting up there in age, should be at least a somewhat positive contributor on that end of the floor when he does get minutes. And again, they're hoping that he can make jump shots. And then last up, another kind of less glamorous addition is Tyson Chandler, who they brought in to provide some depth in the front court. Obviously, you guys know about Tyson Chandler at this point. He's going to roll to the rim. He's going to try to protect the rim. He's going to rebound the ball. In theory, should fit well in this Rockets system, just depending on how many minutes he actually gets. Moving on now to subtractions, and obviously the big one to talk about here is Chris Paul. And even though he had some struggles last year, obviously lost a step, very noticeably lost a step last year specifically, he was still good for them at times. It's just all about how much of an upgrade it is to have Russell Westbrook in that spot and have a player in Westbrook that ideally is actually going to be available for a lot more games than Paul was last year. That relationship between Harden and Paul definitely soured, and it was a good idea to try and ship him out, send him somewhere else. And it's a good idea, in my opinion at least, to try out the Westbrook thing and see how it goes and capitalize on the trade value that Chris Paul did still have. So in my opinion, a good move. Even though they are going to miss Paul, they replaced him with a better player in Westbrook. And then two other guys to briefly mention as well that they lost are Kenneth Faried and Iman Shumpert. Both of them are still unsigned at this point in the offseason, so obviously it's not a huge loss for them. Shumpert, another guy that can defend a little bit, can shoot a little bit, and then Faried can finish a little bit inside, provide some energy at the 5 spot. But outside of that, I mean, they brought in other guys to replace them, so not huge losses for them. Moving on now to the depth chart, and this is where things get a little bit interesting, because obviously you're going to have Harden, you're going to have Westbrook, you're going to have PJ Tucker, you're going to have Clint Capella, but the 3 spot is kind of all over the place for this team. Like, is it going to be Gerald Green? Is it going to be Daniel House? Is it going to be somebody else that we're not thinking about? Is Thabo Sefolosha somehow going to be a starter for this team, and they're really going to run back the old Oklahoma City vibes with, Westbrook and Harden and then Sefolosha? But that 4 core group of players is just going to be so good for this team. And this is kind of traditionally how things have been for Mike D'Antoni over the last few seasons, is just having a lot of reliance on a couple of really good players and just hoping that the system can bring up the statistical contributions of some of the other players on the roster. Like they've got guys like Tyson Chandler coming off the bench in the front court, but in the back court they do have a good amount of depth. Austin Rivers was actually really good for Houston at times last year, and then obviously Eric Gordon coming off the bench as well. The only reason I'm not putting Gordon in there as the starter is just because I feel like they're going to want to spread out that playmaking and scoring a little bit. So if they did want to have both Harden and Westbrook off the floor at the same time, they could have Eric Gordon to put out there as well. But either way, backcourt depth is going to be fine. It's just from the 3 through 4 spots, 3 starters, and then 4 and 5, the depth behind them could definitely be question marks for this team. But at the end of the day, if James Harden and Russell Westbrook are producing at a high level and they're contributing, like 80 points combined between the two of them, between points and assists, they're really not going to need a ton from everybody else on the roster. So maybe during the regular season, they won't have as much success as they had 2 years ago. Like I'm not expecting them to win 65 games, but once the playoffs roll around, once rotations are shortened and they only have to play like 7 or 8 guys, this team is going to be very, very good because they have 2 of the better players in the league on their team in a system that has always helped and benefited players in terms of their statistical contributions in all the spacing and everything that Mike D'Antoni provides. So again, very excited to see them play despite the issues they have at the 3 spot as well as some depth issues in the front court. Moving on now to some players to watch, and I really only have one for this team because you kind of already know everything about the other guys on this roster, and the player to watch is Danuel House. And the reason being is I think he can be a really good, legitimate starting 3 for this team, again, if they're not committed to starting Eric Gordon in that spot. He had some really good moments last year. They signed him to a longer-term deal. Again, just kind of a diamond in the rough player that was elevated by the system. And as long as he maintains his shooting numbers, he's a good defender. He's a good rebounder. He's someone that provides a lot of energy and youth for this team. And I ultimately think he's going to be more useful in the long run than someone like Gerald Green at the 3. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to see him starting in that spot. He's got mentors around him, guys like PJ Tucker that can kind of teach him the ropes. And again, I just think he's going to be really good for this team. Keep an eye on him as potentially a really positive contributor for this Rockets team. The only other kind of flyer I would put out there, this is not like an official player to watch thing, but they do have Chris Clements on like an Exhibit 10 contract or 2-way contract, whatever they're called. They do have him on one of those. Looked good in Summer League, someone that was an outstanding college player, and I would not be surprised at all, whether it's this year or moving forward, for him to be a rotation player for this Rockets team. Not a great defender, obviously, he's only 5'9", but someone that can absolutely score the ball extremely well. And if he can find a way onto the team, this is a system that he is going to play extremely well in. So that's another, just kind of keep an eye on him guy that's obviously a little bit more obscure than some of the other players I typically put in this section for players to watch. But I wanted to add that one other little nugget because, again, you pretty much know everything about all of the players on this roster to this point, outside of maybe House and then obviously Clements, like I said. Moving on now to expectations and predictions. Obviously, I definitely expect this team to be a playoff team and potentially a dangerous one come playoff time if they make some moves to this roster. As currently constructed, I've got them between 50 to 53 wins, not quite in the upper tier of teams in the Western Conference, but I still think that they're going to be very good. And similar to how I was talking about the Warriors and their season preview recently, this is a team that once you get to playoff time, teams are not going to want to play them because they have Westbrook, because they have Harden. Say what you want about their postseason performances in the past, but strictly from a talent perspective, that's going to be a very tough combination to deal with in the postseason. I'm really not as concerned as I thought I would be about the potential fit issues between these two guys, because again, I just think D'Antoni, if he can figure out a way to get Chris Paul and James Harden to work together and stagger those minutes, it shouldn't be any different than Russell Westbrook, with the exception, obviously, the fact that Paul can shoot threes better than Westbrook. But at the end of the day, I think Westbrook's going to be very good. I think Harden's going to be very good. And I think come playoff time, again, this is a team that you're not going to want to see if you were a fan of another team in the Western Conference. And I also think that it's possible that they could package some other players together like House, maybe even look to trade Clint Capella if they find another starting 5 that they think would work well for them, and then further kind of boost their wing rotation, because that's the one weak spot I see here is definitely at the 3 spot unless House has a really good season. So I do think there's a few moves to make here despite the fact that they don't have first-round picks in a couple of seasons coming up because of the Chris Paul trade. I think that this could be a very dangerous team. and I wouldn't be surprised at all if we get to the trade deadline and they've traded for a pretty good wing, and then all of a sudden we're looking at this team like, wow, the Rockets might be able to actually push this thing, make the conference finals, and maybe even the finals. As currently constructed, I don't have them in the top 4 in the West seeding-wise, but if they made some moves, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see them there. And that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.